Hello and welcome back to another WSI Access tutorial. My name is David. I'm here to talk today about access to SQL Server migration. Now, we've made some videos on this topic in the past, but one thing we really want to hit on here is not the mechanics of making the migration. We've done that in other videos, but I do want to talk about some pitfalls that you have to be aware of if you're going to upscale your database from Access to SQL Server or another server solution such as Oracle. There are certain things that you just have to be aware of, certain pitfalls and things that could go wrong, and things you have to be aware of when you do so. Now, in terms of upsizing, when should you do it? I mean, you might say, well, I'm fine. Look, the database is in Access. I'm fine with that. What's the issue? And, if it's a small database, it's just, a retail store with 2 or 3 employees. Your data is not huge. You could probably get away with keeping your back end, your database tables in Access. You certainly should do a database split. That's another thing we talked about in a previous video. So you certainly should split your database, but you can probably keep it in Access. Where you're going to start running into trouble is when you get databases that are large. Access has a limit of 2 gigabytes, and even when you start getting close to 2 gigabytes, you're going to see some major slowdowns. And that brings us to the second bullet point here, is your database running too slow? And as the database gets bigger, I mean, it's common sense that when you get more information in there, well, it's going to take, it's going to take longer to find a customer in a table of 10,000 records than it does in a table of 100 records. I mean, that just makes sense. I mean, no matter how well you index it, we talked about indexing, we talked about speeding up searches, nothing's going to make it instantaneous, especially when you get large amounts of data. Another thing you could find is that the queries are becoming rather complex. Now, Access does have a limitation in queries, in that Access is not as flexible when it comes to things like outer joins, or when you start getting a lot of tables together. When you start getting a query in Access with 5, 6, 7, 8 tables, you have outer joins and inner joins mixed together, it can become, at best, it can become really slow, and at worst, the query may not run at all. At a certain point, you simply can't form the query in Access anymore. It becomes too complex. At best, it's going to run very slow. So those are cases where you would want to start upsizing. Now, there are some things, and this is the main point of this video, there are some things you want to watch out for. Number one is date and time formats. There are some differences. Access basically has a date-time format, but has a date, which is a date-time format. SQL Server has a date-time. They have a date-time too, and there are other date types that you have to look at in terms of compatibility. There are matchups for other data types. This is not necessarily a pitfall, but what is called a long integer in Access is an integer in SQL Server, for example. So you want to make sure, so the data types are, even for numbers, are a little bit different. Now, this third one is very important, and that is the bit data type. And bit basically means yes or no, true or false. It's a data field where there's only 2 possible values. And, for example, is this customer active? Is this invoice paid? That type of thing. There are things that we have to be aware of. For example, Access, if you don't put if you have a bit data type and you have a field and you don't enter yes or no for the data value, Access will assume no or false by default. SQL Server will not make this assumption. It will keep the data type a null value, and that can result in some bad errors, and we've made another video that demonstrates this process, so I'm not going to go into detail here. You also want to check for primary keys both before and after. SQL Server requires all tables to have at least one index and requires a linked table to have a primary key, or else a table cannot be updated. We're going to see an example of this, but when you link a table from SQL Server into Access and there's no primary key defined, you're going to be asked to determine, you get a little pop-up saying which one of these is the unique key. You really have to have primary keys in the table, whereas sometimes in Access you can get away without it, although it's always a good idea even in Access. And of course, you may have to recreate keys and indexes. Most of the times they will transfer over, but sometimes they won't, and you just have to make sure of those things. Kind of along that same line is that record sets and query results which are updatable in Access may not be so in SQL Server. You may have a query, one of the things in queries is we want to be able to use queries to power forms, to provide the data for forms, but we also want to be able to edit them. We also want to be able to add new records. In Access, you can get away with a lot and still be able to update a query. SQL Server is a little pickier. It's more flexible in terms of designing queries. You can design more complex queries, but at the same time, certain queries are not going to be updatable even when they were updatable in Access. So you've got to watch out for that. And the other thing is you also want to get rid of file attachments. You can have an attachment in an Access table. You cannot have an attachment directly in an SQL Server table. There are ways around it, which I'm not going to get into in this video because it's kind of beyond the scope, but they're not so easy to implement. So, personally, I don't recommend file attachments even in Access databases because, for one thing, it makes the database extremely large, and it's going to get you to that 2 GB limit much faster than it would otherwise. They will bloat the size of your database really quickly. It will slow down searches. So generally speaking, my recommendation is if you're going to have images, store the images or other attachments. It could be a PDF, right? Store those attachments in a folder on the hard drive. And simply in the Access database, we store the file path to the location. That's usually much better, even with Access, but with SQL Server, that's just right out. You don't want to be messing with that. If the database is in MDB format, remove user security. This last one kind of goes without saying. Make sure no one is in the Access database before you proceed. Make sure it's closed. You don't have anyone working in the database that could corrupt things. Now, what process would you use? And again, we're not going to make this a video on how to do a database migration. We have other videos that show that. But just real briefly, there's 2 main ways you could do it. The first way I generally wouldn't recommend, and that is using the SQL Server Migration Assistant. I have a link here. You could download it, and that can take an Access database and basically automate the process of installing it to SQL Server. Personally, I don't like it. I don't find that it's very user-friendly. The way I would recommend it, it's more steps, but I think it's easier actually and less error-prone, is to simply create a blank database in SQL Server and then go into the SQL Server Management Studio. That's the user interface to SQL Server. Go in there and then migrate the tables in. That, again, is my personal recommendation. The SQL Server Migration Assistant, in my opinion, is more trouble than it's worth, I think. This is what I was getting at earlier in terms of format. If you only have this, this Jet database engine, that's the earlier format that works with the MDB. If that's all you have, this lower screenshot is from the import and export wizard that I referred to in bullet point 2. So you have to check which source, and these sources represent database drivers. But you really want Access Database Engine, or ACE OLADB. This will allow you to have the source database in the modern ACCDB file format. The ACE OLADB driver is recommended. If you're just using Microsoft Jet Engine, you're going to have to, it will not convert a database unless it's an MDB format. So you have to make that conversion. And that doesn't always work very cleanly. It does most of the time, but not always. So I would recommend having this driver installed, the highlighted one, and that way you can have your database in ACCDB format. That's the modern Access format. Then create the database in SQL Server. You would click on that. For you, it would be a blank database. You go into tasks and then import data. So basically, we're importing Access tables into a new blank database in SQL Server.